These Violent Delights, Chapter 1, September 1926. In the heart of the Scarlet Gang territory, a burlesque club was the place to be. The calendar was rolling closer and closer to the end of the season, the pages of each date ripping free and blowing away quicker than the browning tree leaves. Time was both hurried and unhurried at once, the days becoming scarce yet dragging on far too long. The workers were always hurrying somewhere, never mind whether they truly had a destination to pursue. There was always a whistle blowing in the background. There was always the constant chugging noise of trams dragging themselves along the worn tracks grooved into the streets. There was always the stench of resentment stinking up the neighborhoods, and burrowing deep into the laundry that waved with the wind, like shop banners outside cramped apartment windows. Today was an exception. The clock had paused on the Mid-Autumn Festival, the 22nd of the month according to Western methods of day-keeping this year. Once it was customary to light lanterns and whisper tales of tragedy to worship what the ancestors revered with moonlight cupped in their palms. Now it was a new age, one that thought itself above its ancestors. Regardless of which territory they stood upon, the people of Shanghai had been bustling about with the spirit of modern celebration since sunrise. And at present, with the bells ringing 9 times for the hour, the festivities were only getting started. Juliet Kai was surveying the club, her eyes searching for the first signs of trouble. It was dimly lit despite the abundance of twinkling chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, the atmosphere dark and murky and wet. There was also a strange, sodden smell wafting under Juliet's nose in waves, but the poor renovations seemed not to bother the mood of those seated at various round tables scattered throughout the club. The people here would hardly take notice of a small leak in the corner when constant activity consumed their attention instead. Couples were whispering over decks of tarot cards, men were shaking one another with vigor, women were inclining their heads to gasp and shriek in recollection of whatever story was being told over the flickering gaslight. "You look rather woeful." Juliet didn't immediately turn in haste to identify the voice. She didn't have to. There were very few people who would approach her speaking English to begin with, never mind English with the flat tones of a Chinese mother tongue and the accent of a French upbringing. I am perpetually filled with woe." Only then did she crane her head, her lips curling up and her eyes narrowing at her cousin. "Aren't you supposed to be on stage next?" Rosalind Yang shrugged and crossed her arms, the jade bangles on her slender brown wrists clinking together. "They cannot begin the show without me," Rosalind scoffed, "so I am not worried." Juliet scanned the crowd again, this time with a target in mind. She found Kathleen, Rosalind's fraternal twin, near a table at the back of the club. Her other cousin was patiently balancing a tray full of plates, staring at a British merchant while he tried to order a drink with exaggerated gesticulations. Rosalind was under contract here to dance. Kathleen showed up to wait tables when she got bored and took a measly wage for the fun of it. Sighing, Juliet tugged out a lighter to keep her hands occupied, releasing the flame, then quenching it to the rhythm of the music, gliding around the room. She waved the small silver rectangle under her cousin's nose. "Want?" Rosalind responded by pulling out a cigarette and tucked it within the folds of her clothing. "You don't even smoke," she said, as Juliet angled the lighter down. "Why do you carry that thing around?" Straight-faced, Juliet replied, "You know me, running around, living life, committing arson." Rosalind inhaled her first puff of smoke, then rolled her eyes. "Right." A better mystery would have been where Juliet had even kept the lighter. Most girls in the burlesque club, dancer or patron alike, were dressed as Rosalind was, in the fashionable kipao, sweeping around Shanghai like wildfire, though the outrageous slit down the side revealing ankle to thigh, and the thigh high collar acting like a chokehold. The design was a blend of Western flamboyance with Eastern roots, and in a city of divided worlds the women were walking metaphors. But Juliet had been transformed through and through, the little beads of her pocketless flapper dress swishing with every movement. She stood out here. That much was certain. She was a bright, burning star, a symbolic figurehead for the vitality of the Scarlet Gang. Juliet and Rosalind both quietly turned their attention to the stage, where a woman was crooning a song in a language that neither were familiar with. The singer's voice was lovely, her dress shimmering against dark skin, and this was not the sort of show that this sort of cabaret was known for, and so no one save the two girls in the back were listening. "You didn't tell me you would be here tonight," Rosalind said after a while, smoke escaping her mouth in a quick stream. There was betrayal in her voice, like the omission of information was out of character. The Juliet who had returned last week was not the same Juliet that her cousins had waved goodbye to 4 years ago, but the changes were mutual. Upon Juliet's return, before she even set foot back into the house, she had heard talk of Rosalind's honey-coated tongue and effortless class. After 4 years, Juliet's memories of the people she had left behind no longer aligned with who they had become. Nothing of her memory had withstood the test of time. This city had reshaped itself, and everyone in it had continued moving forward without her, especially Rosalind. It was very last minute. Over at the back of the club, the British merchant that had started pantomiming to Kathleen. Juliet gestured toward the scene with her chin. "Baba is getting tired of some merchant called Walter Dexter pushing for a meeting, so I'm to hear what he wants." "Sounds boring," Rosalind intoned. Her cousin always had a bite to her words, even when speaking with the driest intonation. A smile perked at Juliet's lips. At the very least, even if Rosalind felt like a stranger, albeit a familiar one, she should always sound the same. Juliet could close her eyes and pretend they were children again, sniping at each other about the most offensive topics. She sniffed haughtily, feigning offense. "We all can't be Parisian-trained dancers. Tell you what, you take over my routine, and I'll be the heir to this city's underground empire." A laugh burst from Juliet, short and loud in her amusement. Her cousin was different. Everything was different. But Juliet was a fast learner. With a soft sigh, she pushed away from the wall she was leaning upon. "All right," she said, her gaze latched on Kathleen. "Duty calls. I'll see you at home." Rosalind let her leave with a wave, dropping the cigarette to the ground and crushing it under her high-heeled shoe. Juliet really ought to have admonished her for doing so, but the floor couldn't have gotten any dirtier than its current state, so what was the point? From the moment she stepped into the place, 5 different sorts of opium had probably smeared into her soles. All she could do was push through the club as gingerly as possible, hoping the maids wouldn't damage the leather of her shoes when they scrubbed them clean later tonight. "I'll take it from here." Kathleen's chin jerked up in surprise, the jade pendant at her throat gleaming under the light. Rosalind used to tell her that someone was going to snatch such a precious stone if she wore it so obviously, but Kathleen liked it there. If people were to stare her throat, she always said it would rather be because of the pendant than the bump of her Adam's apple underneath. Her startled expression quickly smothered into a smile, realizing it was Juliet, sliding into the seat opposite the British merchant. "Let me know if I can get anything for you," Kathleen said sweetly, in perfect French-accented English. As she walked away, Walter Dexter's jaw dropped slack. She could understand me the whole time? "You'll learn, Mr. Dexter," Juliet began, swiping the candle from the center of the table and taking a sniff at the scented wax. "That when you assume someone cannot speak English right off the bat, they tend to make fun of you." Walter blinked at her, then cocked his head. He took in her dress, her American accent, and her knowledge of his name. "Juliet Kai," he concluded. "I was expecting your father." The Scarlet Gang called itself a family business, but it did not stop there. The Kais were the pulsing heart, but the gang itself was a network of gangsters and smugglers and merchants and middlemen of all sorts, each and every single one of them answering to Lord Kai. Less enthused foreigners would call the Scarlets a secret society. "My father has no time for merchants with no credible history," Juliet replied. "If it's important, I will pass along the message." Unfortunately, it appeared that Walter Dexter was far more interested in small talk than actual business. "Last I heard, you had moved to become a New Yorker." Juliet dropped the candle back into the table. The flame flickered, casting eerie shadows over the middle-aged merchant. The lighting only deepened the wrinkles in his perpetually scrunched forehead. "I was only sent to the West for education, regrettably," Juliet said, leaning back into the carved couch seat. "Now I am old enough to start contributing to the family business and whatnot, so they dragged me back, kicking and screaming." The merchant didn't laugh along to her joke, as Juliet had intended. Instead, he tapped his temple, ruffling his silver-patched hair. Hadn't you also returned for a brief period of time a few years ago? Juliet stiffened, her grin faltering. Behind her, a table of patrons erupted with uproarious laughter, collapsing in mirth over some comment made among themselves. The sound prickled at her neck, sweeping a hot sweat over her skin. She waited for the noise to die down, using the interruption to think fast and scramble hard. "Just once," Juliet replied carefully. "New York City wasn't so safe during the Great War. My family was worried." The merchant still didn't drop the subject. He made a noise of consideration. "The war ended 8 years ago. You were here a year before previous." Juliet's smile dropped entirely. She pushed her bobbed hair back. "Mr. Dexter, we are here to discuss your extensive knowledge of my personal life, or did we have this meeting actually to have a purpose?" Walter blanched. "I apologize, Miss Kai. My son, he's your age, so I happen to know—" He cut himself off, noting Juliet's glare. He cleared his throat. "I requested to meet with your father regarding a new product." Immediately, despite the vague word choice, it was clear that what Walter Dexter was referring to. The Scarlet Gang was, first and foremost, a network of gangsters, and there was seldom a time when gangsters weren't heavily involved with the black market. If the Scarlets dominated Shanghai, it was hardly surprising that they dominated the black market too. Decided the comings and goings, decided the men who are allowed to thrive and the men who needed to drop dead. In the parts of the city that still belonged to the Chinese, the Scarlet Gang were not simply above the law, they were the law. Without the gangsters, the merchants were unprotected. Without the merchants, the gangsters would have little purpose or work. It was an ideal partnership. The one thing threatened continually by the growing power of the White Flowers, the one other gang in Shanghai that actually had a chance at defeating the Scarlets in black market monopoly. After all, they had been working at it for generations. "A product, huh?" Juliet repeated, her eyes swiveling up absently. The performers had switched, the spotlight dimming as the first opening notes from a saxophone played. Adorned in a brilliant new costume, Rosalind sashayed into view. "Remember what happened the last time the British wanted to introduce a new product into Shanghai?" Walter frowned. "Are you referring to the Opium Wars?" Juliet examined her fingernails. "Am I? You cannot simply blame me for something that was the fault of my country." "Oh, that's not how that works?" It was Walter's turn to look unimpressed. He folded his hands together as skirts swished and skin flashed on the stage behind him. "Nevertheless, I require the help of the Scarlet Gang. I have bulk amounts of lecrocrom to be get rid of. It is certain to be the next most desired opiate on the market." Walter cleared his throat. "I believe you were seeking an upper hand right now?" Juliet leaned forward. In the sudden motion, the beads on her dress clinked together frantically, clashing with the jazz in the background. "And do you really think you can give us an upper hand?" The constant grappling between the Scarlet Gang and the White Flowers wasn't a secret. Far from it, in fact, because the blood feud was not something that raged only between those with Kai and Montagov in their name. It was a cause that ordinary members loyal to each other faction took on personally, with a fervor that could almost be supernatural. Foreigners arriving in Shanghai to do business for the first time received one warning before learning of anything else: pick a side and pick it fast. If they traded once with the Scarlet Gang, they were a Scarlet through and through. They would be embraced in Scarlet territory and killed if they wandered into the areas where the White Flowers reigned. "I think," Walter said softly, "that the Scarlet Gang is losing control of its city." Juliet sat back. Underneath the table, her fists tightened and the skin under her knuckles became bloodless. 4 years ago, she had looked at Shanghai with glitter in her eyes, blinking at the Scarlet Gang with hope. She didn't understand that Shanghai was a foreign city in its own country. Now she did. The British ruled a chunk, the French ruled a chunk, the Russian White Flowers were taking over the only parts that technically remained under Chinese governance. This loss of control was a long time coming, but Juliet would rather bite off her own tongue than admit it freely to a merchant who understood nothing. "We will get back to you regarding your product, Mr. Dexter," she said after a long moment, flashing an easy smile. She let out her exhale imperceptibly, releasing the tension that had tightened her stomach to the point of pain. Now, if you'll excuse me." The entire club fell into a hush, and suddenly Juliet was speaking too loudly. Walter's eyes bugged, latching onto a sight over Juliet's shoulder. "I'll be," he remarked. "It's one of the Bolshies." At the merchant's words, Juliet felt herself go ice cold. Slowly, ever so slowly, she turned around to seek Walter Dexter's line of sight, searching through the smoke and shadows dancing at the entranceway of the burlesque club. "Please don't let it be," she pleaded. "Anyone but—" Her vision turned hazy. For a terrified second, the world was tilting on its axis, and Juliet was barely clinging onto its edge, moments away from taking a tumble. Then the floor righted itself, and Juliet could breathe again. She stood and cleared her throat, concentrating on all her might on sounding as bored as possible when she stated, "The Montagovs emigrated far before the Bolshevik Revolution, Mr. Dexter." Before anyone could take note of her, Juliet slinked into the shadows, where the dark walls dimmed the sparkling of her dress and the soggy floorboards muffled the clanking of her heels. Her precautions were unnecessary. Everyone's gaze was firmly latched on Roma Montagov as he wound his way through the club. For once, Rosalind was carrying out a performance that not a soul was paying attention to. At first glance, it would have seemed like the shock emanating from the round tables has become a foreigner he had walked in. But this club had many foreigners scattered throughout the crowd, and Roma, with his dark hair, dark eyes, and pale skin, could have blended in among the Chinese as naturally as a white rose painted red amid poppies. It wasn't because Roma Montagov was a foreigner. It was because the air of the White Flowers was wholly recognizable as an enemy on the Scarlet Gang territory. From the corner of her eye, Juliet was already catching sight of movement. Guns pulled from pockets and knives pointed outward, bodies stirring with animosity. Juliet stepped out of the shadows and lifted a hand to the closest table. The motion was simple. Wait. The gangsters stilled. Each group watched those nearby an example. They waited, pretending to go on their conversations, while Roman Montagov passed table after table. His eyes narrowed in concentration. Juliet started to creep closer. She pressed a hand to her throat and forced the lump there down, forced her breath to become even until she wasn't on the verge of panic, until she could wipe on a dazzling smile. Once Roma would have been able to see right through her. But 4 years had gone by now. He had changed. So had she. Juliet reached out and touched the back of his suit jacket. "Hello, stranger." Roma turned around. For a second it seemed as if he hadn't registered the sight before him. He stared, his gaze as blank as clear glass, utterly uncomprehending. Then the sight of the scarlet heiress washed over him like a bucket of ice. Roma's lips parted into a small puff of air. The last time he'd seen her, they had been 15. "Juliet!" he exclaimed automatically. But they were no longer familiar enough to use each other's first names. They hadn't been for a long while. Roma cleared his throat. "Miss Kai, when did you return to Shanghai?" "I never left," Juliet wanted to say, but that wasn't true. Her mind had remained here. Her thoughts had constantly revolved around the chaos and the injustice and the burning fury that broiled in these streets, but her physical body had been shipped across the ocean a second time for safekeeping. She had hated it, hated being away so intensely that she felt the force of its burn into a fever each night when she left the parties and speakeasies. The weight of Shanghai was a steel crown nailed to her head. In another world, if she had been given a choice, perhaps she would have walked away, rejected herself as the heir to the empire of mobsters and merchants. But she never had a choice. This was her life, this was her city, these were her people, and because she loved them, she had sworn herself a long time ago that she would do a damn good job of being who she was, because she could be no one else. "It's all your fault," she wanted to say. "You're the reason I was forced away from my city, my people, my blood." "I returned a while ago," Juliet lied easily, checking her hip against the vacant table to her left. "Mr. Montagov, you'll have to forgive me for asking, what are you doing here?" She watched Roma move his hand ever so slightly and guessed that he was checking for the presence of his hidden weapons. She watched him take her in, slow and to form words. Juliet had had time to brace herself. 7 days and 7 nights to enter the city and scrub her mind free of everything that had happened here between them. But whatever Roma had expected to find in this club when he walked in tonight, It certainly hadn't been Juliet. "I need to speak to Lord Kai," Roma finally said, placing his hands behind his back. "It's important." Juliet took a step closer. Her fingers had happened upon the lighter within the folds of her dress again, thumbing the spark wheel while she hummed in thought. Roma said Kai like a foreign merchant, and his mouth pulled wide. The Chinese and the Russians shared the same sound for Kai. Sai, like the sound of a match being struck. His butchering was intentional, an observation of the situation. She was fluent in Russian. He was fluent in Shanghai's unique dialect, and yet here they were, both speaking English, with different accents, like a couple of casual merchants. Switching to either of their native tongues would have been like taking a side, so they settled for a middle ground. "I imagine it must be important if you come all the way here." Juliet shrugged, letting go of the lighter. "Speak to me instead, and I'll pass along the message. One heir to another, Mr. Montagov. You can trust me, can't you?" It was a laughable question. Her words said one thing, but her cold, flat stare said another. "One misstep while you're on my territory, and I'll kill you with my bare hands." She was the last person he would trust, and the same went the other way. But whatever it was that Roma needed, it must have been serious. He didn't argue. "Can we—" He gestured to the side, into the shadows in the dim corners where there would be less of an audience turned toward them, like a second show, waiting for the moment Juliet walked away so they could pounce. Thinning her lips, Juliet pivoted and waved him along the back of the club instead. He was fast to follow, his measured steps coming closely through that the beads of Juliet's dress clinked angrily in disturbance. She didn't know why she was bothering. She could have thrown him to the Scarlets, let him deal with them. No, she decided. He is mine to deal with. He is mine to destroy. Juliet stopped. Now it was just her and Roma Montagov in the shadows. Other sounds muffled and other sights dimmed. She rubbed her wrist, demanding her pulse slow down, as if that were within her control. "Jump to it, then," she said. Roma looked around. He ducked his head before speaking, lowering his voice until Juliet had to strain to hear him, and indeed she strained. She refused to lean any closer to him than she had to. "Last night, 5 white flowers died at the ports. Their throats had been torn out." Juliet blinked at him. "And?" She didn't mean to be callous, but merchants of both their gangs killed each other on the weekly. Juliet herself had already added to the death toll. If he was going to put the blame on her Scarlets, then he was wasting his time. "And?" Roma said tightly, clearly biting back, "if you would let me finish. One of yours, as well as the municipal police officer. British." Now Juliet frowned a little, trying to recall if she had overheard anyone in the household last night muttering about a Scarlet death. It was strange for both gangs to have victims on scene, given that larger killings usually happen in ambushes, and stranger still for a police officer to have been pulled down too. But she wouldn't go as far as to say it was bizarre. She only raised an eyebrow at Roma, disinterested. Until continuing onward, he said, "All their wounds were self-inflicted. This wasn't a territory dispute." Juliet shook her head repeatedly to one side, making sure she hadn't misheard him. When she was certain there was nothing jammed in her ear, she exclaimed, 7 dead bodies with self-inflicted wounds?" Roma nodded. He placed another look over his shoulder, as if merely keeping an eye on the gangsters around the tables would prevent them from attacking him. Or perhaps he didn't care to keep an eye on them at all. Perhaps he was trying to avoid looking straight ahead at Juliet. "I'm here to find an explanation. Does your father know any of this?" Juliet scoffed, the noise deep and resentful. Did he mean to tell her that 5 white flowers, 1 Scarlet, and a police officer had met up at the ports, then torn out their own throats? It sounded like the setup of a terrible joke without a punchline. "We cannot help you," Juliet stated. "Any information could be crucial to discovering what happened, Miss Kai," Roma persisted. A little notch between his eyebrows always appeared like a crescent moon whenever he was irritated. It was present now. There was more than these deaths than he was letting on. He wouldn't get this worked up for an ordinary ambush. "One of the dead was yours. We're not going to cooperate with the White Flowers," Juliet cut in. Any false humor in her face had long disappeared. "Let me make that clear before you proceed. Regardless of whatever my father knows anything about last night's deaths, we will not be sharing it with you, and we will not be furthering any contact that can endanger our own business endeavors. Now, good day, sir." Roma had clearly been dismissed, and yet he remained where he stood, glaring at Juliet like there was a sour taste in his mouth. She had already turned on her heel, preparing to make her exit, when she heard Roma whisper viciously, "What happened to you?" She could have said anything in response. She could have chosen her words with the deathly venom she had acquired in her years away and spat it all out. She could have reminded him of what he did 4 years ago, pushed the blade of guilt in until he was bleeding. But before she could open her mouth, a scream was piercing through the club, interrupting every other noise as if operated in another frequency. The dancers on stage froze. The music was brought to a halt. "What's going on?" Juliet muttered. Just as she moved in to investigate, Roma hissed out sharply and caught her elbow. "Juliet, don't!" His touch seared through her skin like a painful burn. Juliet jerked her arm away faster than if she had truly been alight, her eyes blazing. He didn't have the right. He had lost the right to pretend he ever wanted to protect her. Juliet marched toward the other end of the club, ignoring Roma as he followed after her. Rumbles of panic grew louder and louder, though she couldn't comprehend what was inciting such a reaction until she nudged aside the gathering crowd with an assertive push. Then she saw the man thrashing on the ground, his fingers clawing at his thick neck. "What is he doing?" Juliet shrieked, lunging forward. "Somebody stop him!" But most of his nails were already buried deep into muscle. The man was digging with an animal-like intensity, as if there was something there, something no one else could see crawling under his skin, deeper, 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 until his fingers were wholly buried and was pulling free tendons and veins and arteries. In the next second, the club had fallen silent completely. Nothing was audible save the labored breathing of the short and stout man who had collapsed on the floor, his throat torn into pieces and his hands dripping with blood.